Thank you, Daniel. Next up, we have Garrett.
All right, can you all hear me okay? Good. Well, a lot of people have thanked the organizers already, so I will echo it, but I will also say it's a real privilege to be here at the David Rumsey Center, a place that looms so large in the kind of map and geography imagination that I told Julie my brain actually confected a false memory of having been here before. I have not been to Stanford since this space was opened, but everybody knows the center so well that I mistakenly thought I had. So it's really nice to be here. And really, I want to thank also my co-presenters. It's a really cool group of people from so many disciplines, and I'm pleased to be part of the conversation. I'm going to start my talk by saying that if you've had a chance to browse around to the objects that are on display here in this room, you may have noticed that mine are by far the most boring. They're dull, they're black and white, they're somewhat cryptic. And I want to say a couple of things in my defense, but that actually lead into some of the point of today's talk. The first is that I did that somewhat deliberately to guard against what I think is a kind of common misstep with studies of information graphics, and that it's very easy to get seduced by them. I say that with somebody who works in a visual collection. I love these kinds of things. I love looking at them. I feel the pleasure of the visual pleasures of information graphics. But I think it can be easy to get caught up in their beauty, in their formal and aesthetic characteristics, and in so doing to miss a little bit into which they're contextualized. The other reason I did is that this is not actually a talk about information graphics. It's not even really a talk about the history of cartography. It's a talk about a deep social, political, intellectual, and practical problem of primarily the late 19th and early 20th centuries, for which data visualization and geographic information was seen as a potentially key axis of its solution or of its unraveling. And I want to think a little bit about how both that was true. The people engaged in this question really did need information and graphics, but it also didn't really work. So this is also a story about data visualizations failing. And then the last reason is that I'm jealous of this big screen, and I don't want to be sad when I go home to my little screen and I don't have such a nice place for presenting beautiful graphics. So the nature of the question that I'm going to be grappling with today is the one that the writer, activist, early activist, man of many hats, H.G. Wells described in an address to the Fabian Society in London in 1902. Wells was talking about the reorganization of metropolitan London, and he said that one of the key issues facing modern societies was that the areas in which we shape our public activities at present derive from the needs and conditions of a past order of things. They still preserve the essential conceptions of a vanished organization. Wells is not the only person to say this. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of liberal to left reformers who make the same arguments in the late 19th and early 20th century. But what they meant was that as primarily Western European, Euro-American societies had begun to modernize, their economies changed, new forms of communications and transportation technology had reshaped the material conditions of their life, that the old forms of geographic identity and geographic division, which in many cases were little changed from the feudal period, were no longer sufficient for administering, for governing, or for imagining the geographies of modern life. This is a 1795 plan of the municipality of Boston, the first one that was ordered by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, done by a cartographer who's well represented in our collections, Osgood Carleton. A little blurry to see on the screen, but it shows a municipality which reflected very much a nearly pre-modern concept of what a political economic unit did, based on an agricultural economy, a political economy, and a governing system that was inherited from centuries before. And what Wells and others believed, let me make this bigger, does that make that any clearer? What Wells and others believed was that in the functioning of modern society, new forms of geography had already come into existence, but they had not yet been recognized by authorities, and nor had they certainly been recognized by the public. And they first saw this in administration and in the kinds of modern bureaucracies that had to deal with what we might today think about as big data or large geographic problems. This is a map of the London Postal District in the 1852. Many pointed to administrative agencies like post offices as the kinds of entities who already realized that the old geographies were defunct and no longer practical for working in the modern world, and had created new ones. So this district didn't exist politically. It was not a tax district. It was not an electoral district. It was just the district in which the post office carried out its functions, because that made sense when you're carrying mail around. And increasingly, a set of what I would call liberal objectivist reformers turned to a set of practical interventions in the administrative geography of modern cities. Here we're looking at two maps of the metropolitan region of Boston in the early 20th century. On the left is a map of the service area of the Metropolitan Water and Sewage Board. On the right is a map of the Metropolitan Park Commission's district. They turned to agencies which collected and then administered the workings of a modern city, even when those workings had nothing to do with the internal political geographies of the city itself. In Massachusetts, in eastern Massachusetts, this city, the kind of functional city of Boston, consisted of dozens of independent jurisdictions, all of which had their own bureaucracies, their own electoral systems, their own public finance systems. And reformers turned to maps like these in order to make an argument that these cities really were functionally consolidated, that entities, public entities, single-purpose public entities like water and sewage boards, like park commissions, were already doing the work of administering the city at that scale, and consequently to make arguments to the public about how this really was how we're living now, and we should act as such. They described two kind of key questions around geographic information that these people are grappling with. First, how do we know how big a city is, or where the edges of a metropolitan or regional geography lie? If we wanted to know that from a scientific or empirical perspective, what kinds of data would we look at? Would we look at population? Would we look at economic characteristics? Would we look at the dawning fields of ecology and environmental science? Would we look at topography? What sorts of things, if we were just, researchers, would we say that we would use in order to answer this question? What kinds of information would be useful to us in answering that empirical question? But then atop that empirical question, how do we convince other people, in some cases, tens of millions of people who need to be persuaded, both politically and personally, that these new kinds of places really exist? They might recognize, for instance, the old 18th century borders of the city of Boston. But if our argument is that those borders, those place edges, no longer hold any reality in the modern world, how do we communicate this to people who still feel that way? To borrow H.G. Wells's words, still live in a horse and buggy imagination of modern geography. I'm going to briefly just kind of sidebar to say in this talk, I'm focusing mostly on examples that ask questions about the metropolitan unit, but it's a question that was posed at many different geographic scales. These are two manuscript drawings by an interesting forester, reformer, socialist named Benton Mackay. Was involved in the Tennessee Valley Authority, which you see a map of here, thinking about both large-scale regional units like the watershed. On the right is his proposed redivision of the United States into 13 watershed-based units, as well as much smaller geographies like the neighborhood or the block. So this question has a kind of scalar abstractability to it, even though the examples that I'm using today are mostly at the metropolitan scale. And this is just to kind of prep Ben's talk later. This really lovely isotype diagram of the Mississippi watershed was one of the widely circulated images amongst people who were using the watershed as a proposed regional unit. But back to the city and back to the challenges of making a map for the city that would both be accurate in the empirical sense and also persuasive in the political and social sense. I study this very interesting guy named Sylvester Baxter, who published this piece in 1893. It was a leaflet, essentially, that he printed at his own expense and handed out. Baxter was a journalist a sort of quasi-scientist. He was a socialist reformer who was involved in dozens of kind of do-gooder causes in Boston in the 1890s. But the thing he cared most about was this argument about Greater Boston. And almost all of his arguments were illustrated with relatively simple line maps like this one. In this case, you see the hashed in red area is the original city of Boston, as well as the small number of neighboring communities which it had managed to annex, properly annex by the 1890s. And then his argument that this much larger regional entity of over a dozen municipalities really was the real Boston. And I'll pause on that term. This term comes up over and over and over again. And I think it really actually echoes something that Ji was talking about, which is this idea of appealing to information as unproblematically objective and outside of the realm of politics. People would contrast the real Boston to the political Boston. They would contrast real wherever to the political or fake or historical types of geographic units. And they would do so by recourse to geographic information portrayed on maps and portrayed in other forms like tables. And these really circulate broadly at a moment of kind of high fever pitch of social and intellectual reform in Western cities. This is the Boston Evening Post in 1900. We've got this kind of similar map to the one that Baxter proposed, with this radiating rings to say that, you know, we don't think about this as being the real city because you still identify with your neighborhood or your local town, but this really is it, right? And again, that reemphasizing this, if you look at the numbers, this is true. So here we just have tables of population statistics, and they are in some ways answering the question, how would we count this up, right? In many cases, it's kind of boosters just saying, well, we'll count enough people so that we're the biggest city in the country. Boston was very worried at this time about being surpassed in the kind of league tables of American cities. So a lot of this is like, well, we'll cook the numbers so that we're still in the top 5 cities in the United States if you count all these borders and neighbors. But geographers and scientists are kind of getting into this question at the same time as well. And it's actually really one of the defining disciplinary questions for early geographers, right? Is how do we do this from a scientific perspective? How do we make arguments about what geographic units are like without just arbitrarily saying, well, we'll just start in a city and we'll keep counting until we kind of feel like we've gotten to the edge of it. This is one of my favorite maps of all times. It's enormous. This is, I think, about 9 feet across. It was produced by a geologist at Harvard in consultation with the Olmsted firm, as well as people like Sylvester Baxter, who were involved in Boston politics. Originally sent to Paris for the 1900 exhibition, and then it came back to Boston, and it was the centerpiece of a year-long kind of public reform display. And the people who put on this show said, the one thing that everybody's got to see is to visualize themselves in this larger metropolitan area. And they were forced to walk by this map before they got to it. Another sidebar, at the time, they said, this should go to the Boston Public Library when we're done with it. Instead, it languished in basements for the whole 20th century, and it's now at the wastewater treatment plant. Actually in good shape, but if I ever have to do a heist, I'm taking this one back. But it was a piece of, this was clearly a piece of public rhetoric, right? So it was done by scientists, it was done by kind of experts relying on quite sophisticated geographic methods at the time, but it was for people to see. At the same time, the bureaucratic state and kind of experts are doing the same thing, but with a very different kind of audience in mind. They're doing it simply to conduct the business of administering a modern state. The very first time that the Census Bureau starts thinking about geographies other than the ones that are inherited from the past is in the 1905 Census of Manufacturers. And Boston is one of the cities where they say, we can't just count up Boston. It doesn't make any sense. You actually can see here certain suburbs, towns, and cities are connected with Boston by trolleys and steam railroads and are so closely allied industrially that it seems proper to consider them as part of the industrial district of which Boston is a center. So when we count up the statistics, publish them in census information, we're going to use this larger region. Well, what's the region? They do a little bit of kind of connectivity mapping, linking mapping here, counting up the industrial district. And it's not only the federal government that's doing this, but state entities as well. So this is a metropolitan planning map from the mid-1920s published by state and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And it uses, this is also for RJ, it uses circles. It was looking at the emergence of this sort of inner and then even outer ring of suburbs that were growing faster than the city proper at this time. The circles show population counts, and then the bar graphs show change. But it was essentially making the argument that the state needed to kind of govern this entire entity as a single thing, that it didn't make sense anymore to talk about Boston and Cambridge and Somerville. It just made sense to talk about a metropolitan entity, which was displayed in terms of these abstract statistics. So the audience here is experts, right? It's administrators, it's people doing the governing of the modern state. And that increasingly becomes what the data does. The conversation is for experts and administrators, and mysteriously, the kind of broader public conversation, the one that people like Baxter or the Olmsted firm that commissioned that topographical map, recedes over the course of the 20th century in what I think is a really curious way. People stop trying to make the case broadly that the world has been transformed, that the geography of the world has changed. And instead, bureaucrats just say, well, we're going to use these units that nobody else may even really know about, but they're the real ones. When we're doing statistical information, when we're doing analysis, those are the ones that we will make reference to. This is the first time that Boston gets a defined metropolitan statistical area, at the time still just called metropolitan district in the 1930 census. The Census Bureau was defining metropolitan districts around the country at this time. This is also from the 1930 census. By the time we hit the middle 20th century, the census is essentially using its entirely new confected sets of geographies, which we're now familiar with, or those of you who work with geographic information are familiar with standard metropolitan statistical areas. The idea is to create a real, homologous, geographically accurate and statistically accurate sets of geographic units that can do the work of demographic science. And one of my favorite maps of these is this interesting one by a Finnish geographer. The Finns were actually very experimentally interested in this kind of like geographic unit question. But a value by area cartogram of the standard metropolitan statistical areas published in the Annals of the Association of American Geographers in 1968. It's not only administrators, but also kind of economic elites, which kind of recognize this new kind of geography as a thing that they do. So this is a map from the Rumsey collections, actually a Massachusetts-based international data corporation, which was looking at the market areas of personal computers and at the time. And, you know, straightforwardly saying, we're not going to measure this by states or counties or older geographies, right? The thing we're measuring is metropolitan statistical areas. So you know, a firm which is certainly data oriented in the market, or, you know, working in computerization of technology, and like many you know, sort of business organizations to this day, using these imagined or statistically defined units to do its work. But nobody, I always say this, like, anybody here have like an outline map of a place they care about, either like on their wall or a poster or a sticker on your laptop or a you know, a necklace? You see these all the time, right? I have never seen a metropolitan statistical area on any of these. Like, like here's the shape of the Boston MSA. And this is the kind of fundamental puzzle that I'm interested in, right? At the same time that from an empirical perspective, we say, these new kinds of statistically defined units are the real ones, right? They're the ones that reflect an objective sense of the geography in which people are living in the 20th century. They nevertheless fail to gain any kind of emotional purchase whatsoever in those same spaces. And in doing so, fail to gain any kind of political legitimacy to them as well, right? So these are not places that you vote. These are not places that you pay taxes. These are not places where a representative in Congress, you know, goes to Washington to say, I'm the representative of the, you know, San Jose MSA or whatever. And so there becomes a split. What is real in this sense, right? What is accurate? What is objective? And I don't think that that's a straightforward question to answer. And I'm going to close actually with one of my attempts to answer it, not this one. This, I think, actually is more kind of rhetorically an example of the sorts of geographies that might have purchase on people's hearts. A study that was done by the New York Times in 2014 of, you know, Major League Baseball fandom areas, right? Like maybe this is the real regional geography of the United States as exposed by people's preferences. But I did this study published in PLoS One with my colleague Alistair Ray at Sheffield. And I want to say a few things about this in closing. Partly to be, I want to be skeptical of this actually. So this is the beautiful thing, right? Like this is a map that we made by taking hundreds of millions of points of data about commuter connections in the United States, where people are living and where they're going to work. And we subjected it to a very kind of like, whatever, cutting edge, new type of computer simulation called partition analysis, where we asked the computer to redraw the edges of units. Left aside state boundaries, county boundaries, any other kind of boundaries. Let the computer do it instead. Let statistical analysis do it instead. And it spit out this really amazing thing with these really interesting kind of regionalization boundaries. But how most people engaged with this was, wow, data, right? Like this is kind of beautiful and colorful. It's overwhelmingly complicated, right? There's hundreds of millions of pieces of data encoded into this data set. And I think that kind of sublime is both interesting in a rhetorical sense, and most people were not thinking about the math of partition analysis. They were thinking about, wow, like this crazy thing that reflects real truth because it's big data and because it's beautiful. Maybe that has actually more of a rhetorical power on them and how they're thinking. And I think we should both be like mindful of this and cautious of it. When you see big data and geographic information as they're kind of manifested and pressed into service today, you oftentimes have this kind of effect, right? Kind of overawedness at the incredibility, the perfect kind of computational authority of visual images like this. And what both Alistair and I really tried to emphasize, both in the piece itself as well as our, this kind of got like some media press, and so we were talking to media about it, was like, let's actually be careful here, right? Like there's all sorts of reasons why this regionalization problem, which goes back to the 19th century, is very hard and very difficult to figure out, right? It's wherever you draw a border or a boundary, there's always going to be error there, or there's always going to be an ambiguity there. And this kind of false sense of accuracy that emerges out of the geographic sublime, the data sublime, I think is one to be really cautious about. So I know we're running like a little late, and then we're gonna get to lunch. So I'm gonna trim it off there. Happy to talk about anything over lunch. And then Julie, are we gonna try to do some conversation now, or do we want to go right to lunch? Great, cool, thank you.
You want to just, Daniel wants to just eat. Do we have maybe one question? Do we have a microphone here? Okay, hold on. We've got one question way in the back, and then we'll break for lunch.
To punish Daniel for wanting to eat, I'll ask him a question about Priestley. I was always struck by Priestley's timelines that they were not very actually information dense. There's a lot there, but it's 6 buckets. And other than, seeing that famous people lived at the same time, there isn't much else going on there. They're sort of packed for space. It always reminded me of like a curio cabinet where he had collected all of his famous people and sort of packed them into 6 different shelves. I was wondering if Priestley ever thought more about it, thought about the fact that like Aristotle and Plato weren't just coincident, they were related by more than that, and ever sort of imagined how you could have connected these people or grouped them in more substantive ways.
Thank you. So one of the big themes of the talk that I just gave is Priestley's passion for simplification and for stripping out the unnecessary from data. And he absolutely did think about all of those things. These both of these diagrams came out of his work as a history teacher. He got this job when he was 28 teaching history, and like the rest of us had to read a lot of books and figure out how to do it. And one of the things that struck him, and this is throughout his writing, is how many layers of reduction are necessary in order to teach well. And he looked at all of these other charts, and he loved Barbeau, and he loved Talents, and he loved Helvicus, all these people, but there was too much data in the representations. And so this is actually, it's the beginning, for me, this is the beginning of a train of thought toward a project in praise of epitome, in praise of epitomization, in praise of stripping down narratives to their bare bones. So yeah, Priestley did think about that. He was specifically resisting that more multidimensional, more multifactorial analysis that you're asking for, because he thought that the promise of the diagram was this kind of data representation which stripped everything else away.